Let me put it this way. I'd like to think that God is real.
I don't believe in God because the idea that an omniscient, loving being would judge me, who is mortal and ignorant, based on a few years' experience, I find to be rather a cruel thought.
All the power that God has, he, she, it has given to me. So we're definitely one.
I hope there's something else out there. It'd be fun to experience either that or we're all just evolved apes.
I
was raised atheist. I don't believe in a higher power, but I also don't claim to know everything about the world.
I don't know. I don't know if there is one. I just pretend, I guess, and hope that there's something else out there.
So, does God really exist? Or is the idea of God something that the primitives made up to fill in the gaps of things they didn't understand? An idea that thanks to science now we have all outgrown. Is the universe an accident? An amazing, miraculous accident? Or did God, like a real, personal, super intelligent being, create it with reason for a reason? Are we the personal, intentional creations of a brilliant, loving intellect, or are we all just random, accidental bags of molecules? And if we are, does anything matter? Does anything at all matter, really? And if there is a God, where is he? Like, why doesn't he show up more often? Why isn't he, if you will, more obvious? Or you might say, why are we so oblivious? And are we just supposed to take the whole thing by faith? We're just supposed to believe and maybe stop asking all these questions. And while you're chewing on those questions, and some people, as we said last week, have faith that seems to come easy, and it always has. And some of us really struggle with the idea of faith. We're natural-born skeptics and doubters and cynics. Some of us are in a stage of life where we're gaining faith and coming to faith. Some of us are in a stage of life where we're maybe losing faith or trying to regain faith. Meanwhile, cool fact, regardless of what you believe, we are all traveling, all of us, 67,000 miles per hour around the sun, and there's hardly even a breeze outside today. 20 miles every time you blink. Another 20 miles, another 20 miles every time you blink, and we've been doing it our entire lives. And the precise orbit or the nature of that orbit, our exact distance from the sun, the existence and size of our moon that keeps our Earth tilted at a 23.5 degree axis, keeps us in a kind of zone, if you will, that's not too hot and not too cold so that life can exist. Anyone want to guess what that zone is called? You want to guess? The Goldilocks zone. I kid you not. The Goldilocks zone, there's us, not too hot, not too cold, just right. And while you were thinking about the answer about that zone, your body just created 10 million new cells, hashtag no big deal. 2.5 million cells every single second, each of them amazingly complex. Molecular machines, if you will, manufacturing biological products, continually checked for errors and automatically corrected, all of them accomplishing specific tasks and reproducing themselves in very specific ways, blood cells and skin cells and cilia and toenails, and always in the way they're supposed to be, or almost always in the way that they're supposed to be, so that you never grow liver cells on your elbow or, God forbid, toenails on your cheek, right? And embedded each of them with this chemical script called DNA, which is 3 billion characters long, every single cell, while we wrestle with what we believe about ultimate things. So today we are in part 2 of this series, The Big God Questions. It's based on the most Googled questions about God, faith, and Christianity. Full disclosure, I said last week, this is a compilation list of much, much longer lists that you can find by Googling the most Googled questions about God and faith. Questions like, Questions like, why is there so much pain and suffering in the world? The number one most Googled question, and understandably so, and we're going to talk about that next week. Or can I actually take the Bible seriously? I mean, do you seriously expect me to take the Bible seriously? Isn't it just a collection of myths and fairy tales and made-up stories written hundreds of years after the events? Are you supposed to take those stories literally? So there's talking snakes and a guy gets swallowed by a fish. I mean, can you take this document or these documents seriously? And then what about Christianity? Isn't it too exclusive to say that there's only one way that's right? That just doesn't feel right. What about diversity? What about many ways to God and as long as you're sincere? And then maybe the most personal question of them all, does life have any meaning or any purpose that I don't make up for myself? I mean, I can make up meaning, I can make up purpose for me, but is there anything bigger than that? Is there anything bigger than us? Great questions that I think are worth talking about and worth thinking about, and so we're going to talk about them and think about them. And we began last week by looking at this first question, who is or who was Jesus? And this week we're talking about this second question, is there a God? Is there a God? Hasn't science already disproved that myth? Why are we still talking about this? Are there reasons? And I mean reasons. I don't mean just have faith and you're just supposed to believe. Are there reasons to believe that there is a God? Now, contrary to popular opinion, and I think this just needs to be said before we jump in, the world does not divide neatly between believers and unbelievers, between people who have faith and people who don't have any faith. We all believe something. In fact, we all believe some things and a lot of things, like hundreds, if not thousands and thousands of ideas and conclusions and assumptions about everything and everyone in our lives. Mental maps, they're sometimes called, or worldview webs, which are essentially our belief systems which are our operating systems. And in all of our worldviews, there are gaps. Some of them pretty significant. There are these unanswered questions, pieces, often important pieces that we don't know, perhaps because we haven't pursued, and sometimes we don't know because they're actually unknown, and even smart people who've been thinking about them and talking about them for centuries haven't yet answered those questions. And we all fill in our gaps. We all have gaps, and we all fill them in with something. Theists notoriously fill in their gaps sometimes with God. Well, it's just God. Why did that happen? I don't know. It's just God. How did that happen? I don't know. It's God, sometimes called the God of the gaps, which to non-theists feels really frustrating and uncurious. And yet non-theists fill in the gaps as well, often with science. Well, science hasn't figured that out, but I believe it will, which is a belief statement, right? We are all believers, and we all like to think of ourselves as reasonable or as reasonable believers. But what reason or what reasons are there to believe in God, to take that thought or idea seriously? And so today I want to take a look at 6 types of reasons, or 6 types of evidence, if you will. Alvin Plantinga, who has been called the greatest philosopher of our time, says that there are actually 24 or so philosophical proofs for God's existence. We're going to narrow those down to just a few, and quite honestly, I just got to be honest, we are going to be skimming across the top of them. And we're going to take a look at just a handful of them, all of which could be taken deeper. The first, beginning with, literally the beginning, the evidence of existence. The evidence of existence, the biggest mystery of them all, the biggest maybe miracle of them all, that there's something here, that something actually exists. Why does anything exist in the first place? Why is there something rather than nothing? Nothing would require no explanation, and there would be no one here to explain it anyway. But something seems to require some kind of explanation. And scientists universally agree that there was a beginning to this something, or at least nearly universally agree that there was a beginning to this something, and it began with a bang. 14 billion years ago, this infinitely dense ball of matter and energy, the size of a grape seed roughly, exploded into a flash of light and energy. A flash of light that, thank you Einstein for E equals mc squared, a flash of light that actually contained all of the matter and energy in the universe, which is just kind of mind-blowing to think. Now, to say that it exploded, sounds a bit chaotic. This explosion was extraordinarily precise. In fact, Stephen Hawking, in his book A Brief History of Time, says if the expansion rate of the universe was different by 1 part in 100,000 million. Think about that number, 100,000 million, just 1 in 100,000 million, just 1 second after the Big Bang, the universe would have either collapsed back on itself or never have developed galaxies at all. But why? But why and from where? Like, where did that grape seed come from anyway? How does nothing become something, let alone something pretty amazing? As far as we know, and that needs to be said, something never comes from nothing, right? Now, in philosophy or in philosophy and logic, this is often called the cosmological argument. The cosmological argument, which goes like this: everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Everything that begins to exist has a cause outside of itself. Things do not cause themselves to exist. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause that by definition is outside of nature. You would say supernatural, but that carries other connotations, something outside of nature and non-contingent upon what we would call nature. Now, of course, scientists and cosmologists continue to attempt to come up with theories and explanations for this cause or for all of this to exist, and they should continue. I hope they do continue. Theories like the multiverse theory, which, by the way, is nothing like what you see in cartoons or in popular TV shows, and the oscillating universe theory, both of which postulate that there are many attempts to do this, and we just happen to live in the one that did it right, and other theories as well, none of which have gained wide enough acceptance or covered enough bases to actually be accepted or taken fully seriously just yet. In fact, even Richard Dawkins, who suggests the multiverse theory as a reason to explain how our universe might look the way it does without a designer, he threw that out there. Maybe there are many universes, and we just happen to live in the one that came out right. When he was pressed, I was listening to an interview with him. When he was pressed, hey, do you really believe that? He said, nah. It's too improbable. It's pretty much impossible. But he added this: cosmology is still waiting on its Darwin, meaning cosmology, the origins of everything, is still waiting for somebody to come up with something plausible enough so as not to be impossible. And maybe somebody will. Maybe someone will. Science has a way of filling in gaps with knowledge. Now, of course, as many skeptics like Sam Harris have responded, even if our universe did have a cause, a super intelligent, non-contingent, beyond nature cause, that does not mean that that cause was God as we understand God, which is true. That's true, but this is just the first of many. It's a beginning point and an important beginning point, because it's not just that something's here. It's what is here, which leads us to a second piece of evidence, the evidence of life. The evidence of life. We now know that first life actually appeared very quickly after the earth was formed, almost immediately. Almost immediately as the earth cooled, bacteria and algae formed, these tiny single-celled living organisms all over the planet, all at once, eating up the toxic chemical waste and creating oxygen. Amazing. Now, to Darwin, cells were these simple blobs of protoplasm, and he considered the evolution of simple cells to be an easy thing, like no big deal. But cells are not simple. Each one of these cells, these first cells, was a complex machine. In fact, more than a complex machine, like a factory, if you will, moving, eating, growing, reproducing itself, giving off oxygen, all of them containing information in its DNA that's equal to, a la Richard Dawkins, 1,000 Encyclopedia Britannicas inside each one of these single cells that are now living. Now, from nothing to something, that's a huge leap. From nothing at all to something being here, but from inorganic, lifeless matter, from rocks and water to what atheist turned Christian Francis Collins, who headed the Human Genome Project, calls the digital elegance of DNA. He referred to DNA as the language of God. How is that even possible? Like, how does that leap take place, that lifeless matter became the first living cells? Nobel Prize winning biologist Christian de Duve writes in his book, Tour of the Living Cell, he says, if you were to equate the probability of the birth of a bacteria cell to chance assembly of its atoms, eternity will not suffice to produce even one of them. Again, life, the existence of life itself, as unanswerable as that currently is and how that might have began, it is not sufficient proof, if you will, that an infinitely creative and super intelligent, loving, relational creator God that we believe in might exist, but it starts to get us a little closer. The beginnings of life of a single cell, a living cell, then leads us to a third piece of evidence, the evidence of design. The evidence of design. Now, again, it's not just that something's here. We wouldn't be here. It would just be rocks and lava and poisonous gases and so forth. And now there's something living that's here, but what's here is amazingly complex and amazingly precise. In other words, here's an example for you. For organic life to have begun and to survive, for us to actually be here and still be here, the basic, what are called regularities and constants of physics, like the speed of light and the law of gravity and the strong and weak nuclear forces and others of these constants, they must all have values that together cumulatively fall into an extremely narrow range. Astrophysicists tell us that there are roughly 122 variables that would have had to have been set at precise values in order for our universe to even come into existence or to remain intact as it currently does. And if that any one of the 122 is off by even 1 part in a million, or in some cases 1 part in a millionth, matter would not be able to hold together or coalesce, meaning no planets, no stars, no atmosphere, no water, no people, no life at all. 122 dials, all set with incredible precision, which then actually raises another question. Where did the dials come from? Like, where did the laws of physics themselves, the constants themselves, come from? And for many, that question as well, the existence of the regularities and the constants themselves are further clues and evidence for design, which then is evidence possibly of a designer. In fact, Stephen Hawking, to quote him again, said, "It would be very difficult to explain why the universe would have begun in just this way, except as the act of a God who intended to create beings like us." This is sometimes called the anthropic principle or the fine-tuning argument that the whole universe, the solar system, our position in the galaxy, our planet and its position in our solar system, the whole thing, it seems like a cosmic welcome mat for us. Like it seems almost prepared, if you will, for beings like us. An environmental scientist named Bob Davis put it this way: the sheer degree of precision is hard to fathom. It would be the equivalent, imagine this, you who bake and cook things, it would be equivalent of a recipe requiring us to count individual grains of sugar, measure molecules of milk. You're gonna need some whole new equipment for this. To calculate the thousandths of a degree of temperature for the oven and the correct fraction of a second to shut it off, only with the added bonus that if you are off just 1 grain of sugar too many or too few, your cake doesn't just turn out bad, your house gets sucked into a black hole or explodes in pieces in the neighbor's front yard. So you better be careful with the grains of sugar, right? Extraordinary precision. Evidence of design, evidence of life, evidence of just our existence or the existence of something at all. Now, shifting gears a bit to ourselves and humanity, next comes the evidence of morality. This one's a little more complicated. The evidence of morality, just the very existence of categories like right or wrong, good or evil, justice or injustice, categories that we somehow intuitively believe exist outside of us, outside of our own desires and preferences, by which we actually judge our own desires and preferences and consider ourselves at times to be right or wrong, good or evil, moral or immoral, and certainly judge other people as well. Where does that come from? Where does morality come from? And think about it this way. In a purely materialistic world, all of those ideas are just illusions. If all we are, good and evil, justice and injustice, they are not attributes ascribable to molecules. Molecules are not good or evil. They're not just or unjust, they're just molecules. And if all we are is bags of molecules, nothing you ever do could be objectively considered evil or wrong. Society may call it evil or wrong. People around you may decide or think that that's right or wrong, but they would have no rational reason whatsoever to tell you so. Like your bag of molecules telling my molecules what to do, where do your molecules get off? Like my molecules are just fine, thank you very much. Whether you're moralizing about saving a species or saving the planet or caring for the poor, all of it is just an illusion. Now, here's the irony, just before we jump into something further. The irony is that as many people struggle with the idea of God precisely because there's so much in this world that feels wrong. And it does. It feels wrong, it feels evil, it feels unjust. We're going to pick this up next week. The irony is that the moment you step across the line from God into a there is no God worldview, you're left with a worldview that actually doesn't even make sense of your ache. A worldview that tells you your ache is meaningless and illusion. There is no good. There is no evil. There is nothing to be aching for. And that doesn't sit quite right, even if it is true, by the way. Now, evolutionary biologists argue, and I believe to some extent this is true, that our morality is somewhat socially constructed and or left over from purely Darwinian evolutionary processes, survival of the fittest and so forth. In other words, like our ancestors who behaved in certain ways for the good of themselves and the good of the tribe and the good of one another, they had a greater likelihood of surviving and passing on their genes, and that's why we have that sense of morality and not another. And I think okay, so there's some truth to some of that. A lot of what is good and right is definitely good for us and definitely good for the people closest to us, our loved ones and our tribe, but not all of it. And here's where it gets sticky. Not everything that we consider good and moral is actually helpful for the survival of the fittest. In fact, sometimes it's actually contrary to it. Jonathan Haidt, whose writings I love, he's a social psychologist and a professor at NYU's University Stern School of Business. He is the world's leading researcher on something called elevation. Elevation, which is the universal response, he says, that people have to witnessing an act of moral beauty. There's something that happens within us. He's been studying this phenomenon for about 15 or more years, and he began with the question, it's the assumption of all social sciences that we are motivated primarily by self-interest. So then the question becomes, if that's so, then why do we care so much, and why are we moved so much by acts of moral beauty and heroism, especially when a stranger does something good and selfless for a stranger, somebody who is not part of our tribe at all, and we have no emotional attachment to it. And the research shows this is actually a physiological thing. Elevation is a physiological thing where we feel a slight expansion in our chests and we feel light in our bodies. Our emotions feel inspired. Why? Why is that in us and seems to be transcultural? Like it seems to be in everybody. And what's interesting as I read Haidt's research is he goes on after describing his research to try to explain it in purely evolutionary terms of how survival of the fittest could have accounted for that. And he's working that argument. And personally for me, I just got to say, as some of these arguments, which are so reverse engineered, we see this, so it must be this, so maybe we can trace the line this way. It just seems so forced in this particular case and so convoluted. I love feeling like, it might have just been better to end the whole research project going, go figure. That's weird, right? That we all have this thing called elevation. Where's that? I don't know. In fact, I resonate a little bit more with author Timothy Keller, who says this, and this is kind of my feeling as I was reading Haidt's research. For evolutionary purposes, hostility to all people outside one's group should be widely considered moral and right behavior and even heroic behavior. Yet today, we believe that sacrificing, time and energy and money and emotion and even someone's very own life, especially for someone not our kind or not our tribe, that is what's right and that is what's heroic. And so, for example, if we see a stranger fall into a river, there's this impulse that people have to save them or that someone should save them, especially if that person is not the most fit for survival, especially if they are more likely to die without someone helping them. And if I can't jump in and save them for some reason, I am likely to feel very badly about that. And if someone else clearly could, and doesn't, we don't consider that a morally neutral choice that person made. Well, it's not a tribe. It's like, I get it. Like, why would you? Of course not. We don't consider it right. We don't consider it neutral. We are likely to consider it actually evil. Evil that someone had the opportunity to do something so good and chose not to do it. And Keller asked this question, how could that trait, and this is the question I think to ask, how could that trait have come down by process of natural selection? Such people who were jumping into rivers to save strangers would have been less likely to survive and pass on their genes. A reasonable observation, a reasonable question, right? So then where does that come from? Where does that come from? And our sense that it's actually outside of us, that it's objective, it's something that judges us and by which we judge others. Is there a source of that? Is there a source of moral goodness that's outside of us? And a sense of that goodness, a residue of our original glory that's actually within us? Is there something to that? Now, similar to the evidence of morality is this next piece, the evidence of meaning. The evidence of meaning. Now, we're going to talk about this more specifically in week 6 of the series, where it gets very personal about the meaning of our own lives. But simply put, if there is no God, just like our sense of good and evil is an illusion, big questions like, who am I? Why am I here? What's the meaning of all this? Why did that happen? Why does anything happen? What is my purpose? What is my contribution? Am I significant? What should I do with my life? All of those questions are just illusions. There is no point. There's no point. There is no purpose. As Ernest Hemingway once said, life is just a dirty trick, a short journey from nothingness to nothingness. There is no meaning other than the meaning that you write or create for yourself. And by the way, not just for you personally, for everyone and for everything that you know, for your parents and your family and your friends and your new hot crush and your newborn child. It's all meaningless, as are all of the causes you believe in meaningless. The things that you feel worth fighting for are actually meaningless in the end. It's all just a short journey from nothingness to nothingness. The Apostle Paul, who was writing to some followers of Jesus in ancient Ephesus, he said this. Here's a beautiful statement. We are God's handiwork. We're God's creation, created in Christ Jesus. Now, that's a deep phrase, multifaceted, and would be fun to unpack. But here's where he's going with this. To do something. Created to do something good works that we are somehow prepared in advance for us to do. There is a reason for elevation. There is a reason. There's something deep inside of us that is deeply true of who we are, that resonates with what is good and beautiful and glorious and generous. And French existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre said, Nah, I don't buy it for a second. Man has no divinely prepared nature to be fulfilled by action. What is he but a little puddle of water whose freedom is death? That's dark, right? That's dark, but here's what he's doing. He's chasing down his worldview to its logical conclusion. Now, that's tough to buy. It's tough to buy even for Sartre, who had a difficult time living out this utter meaningless of life and of his own life. And so he writes, man is absurd, but he must grimly act as if he were not. Which raises the question, why? Why must we grimly act as if we're not absurd? Why must we act as if there is meaning not only to our own lives, but to the lives of the people around us, that there's more to this life than this life? Why do purpose and meaning and significance actually seem to tap into something very, very deep inside of us? That original glory that we were created with. Is that evidence for something bigger than us? Is that evidence that there is more to this life than this life? And some would say, no, it's not. And some would say, yes, it is. So evidence, the evidence of existence, the evidence of life, the evidence of design, the incredible complexity and precision, evidence from morality, evidence from meaning, and one more for today, the evidence of Jesus. The evidence of Jesus, which is the evidence of history, not just of faith or belief or dogma, the evidence of something specifically that happened. And this is where all the first followers of Jesus always took this question ultimately, no matter where they began. For great thinkers like Paul or John or Luke, the greatest evidence for who God truly is, that there is a God and what that God is like, was always, in the end, Jesus. It was his life and his behaviors and his teaching, and then especially, and this is the shocking, unexpected part of it, especially his shameful crucifixion and his resurrection from the dead. And for the first followers of Jesus, these things weren't matters of faith. These weren't Bible stories that they grew up believing in and telling other people they needed to believe. This was for them the solid and verifiable evidence of history, that God had acted in history to show us that he is and who he is and exactly how he feels about you, and to show us who we are and what it means to be human, to live up to the glory, the meaning and significance that is our true identity. In fact, the Apostle John, after spending years with Jesus, an eyewitness to the whole story, listened to Jesus, everything he watched, everything he did, all as he's processing his experiences many years later, writing his biography of Jesus, he begins his story of what it was like to be a part of that, reaching all the way back as he introduces us to Jesus, reaching all the way back to the beginning of time, intentionally riffing on this ancient creation story that was part of his own heritage. And here's how he opens his biography. Here's his opening line. In the beginning was the Logos. And the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. Now that word Logos, it's in the Greek language that John is writing in, it's could be translated a word or a message. But for the Greeks, that word Logos was the idea of logic and reason and rationality and intelligence. And the Greeks believed that behind the fabric of the seen universe, if you will, or the seen world, behind that lay reason and logic, immaterial and impersonal, if you will, reason and logic. It's a force, not actually an intelligence. And that's when John does something, because as they open this line, it's like everybody's head, Jewish background people, Greek background people are tracking with him. All the heads are nodding in the same direction. And then John does something that would have made all of his readers stop and notice. Here's what he says next. He was with God in the beginning. It's like he. Yeah, this reason, this logic was personal. It was intentional. That logic or reason was with God in the beginning, and it was personal, and through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that was made. And by the way, these words right here inspired the forefathers of modern science to expect reason and predictability and logic and organization to be behind everything they researched and studied, which is why they felt like they could do it. And then he says this, in him was life, and that life was the light of all humankind, and the light shines in darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And then John adds this line, this shocking, shocking line. Here's the conclusion that they had all come to when they had been with Jesus. As they're wrapping their heads around it, the Logos became flesh. This personal force of reason or intelligence that was behind all of creation actually became a human being. And John's like, I don't know how to explain this to you. I don't even know how to say it, except that he lived among us. He set up a tent for a while and lived among us, and we saw glory. And now he's riffing on the great story of Moses taking the people out of Egypt. We saw the glory of God, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth, which is a way in the Hebrew Scriptures of describing the very character of God. We saw who God is. We saw his character, and he is full of grace and truth. No one's ever seen God, but But the only Son, himself God, is near the Father's heart, and he has made him known. And John will go on in his biography to describe just how, in his life and in his teachings and in his dealings with people, and especially in his crucifixion, which John, more than any other writer, equates with his glory, that his crucifixion was glory. Glory on that cross, and then his resurrection, just how Jesus made the true character of God known and visible to all of us. The evidence of Jesus. His life, his death, and especially his resurrection, which we unpacked a little bit last week, and the overwhelming historical evidence to support it, for me, is the defining piece of evidence for God and for who God is. By the way, don't miss week 5, Isn't Christianity Too Exclusive, where we unpack that a little bit more. But reasons, right? Reasons, not just you should have more faith and you just need to believe in faith and have faith in faith. Evidence, clues, the evidence of pure existence, of life, of design, of morality, of meaning, and then especially for me, the evidence of Jesus himself. Now, these are just a small handful of reasons and clues, if you will. Dozens more, some very technical, some very philosophical, historic, scientific, experiential, and it's not so much what rises and falls on each one of them, because each one of them can be pushed back against and then back and forth, but it's the cumulative effect of all of the evidence as they're brought together. It's like God has been leaving clues around the house the whole time. From the very beginning, just dropping clues all over the house. Clues that point not only to his existence, but also to his character, discernible in not just what he made, but how he made it, how we can see who God is just through what he made, and clues to the story. The big story that we are all a part of, clues that are not only outside us and around us, but clues that are within us, in us individually, and in us as humans, and in humanity, in our cultures, and our societies, fallen as we are from original glory. Clues all over the place. So that, he did this so that, as Paul would say in a speech to a bunch of philosophers in Athens, he did all of that so that we human beings would seek him. And just maybe reach out for him and find him, though he is not that far from any one of us. As unbelievable as it seems, and it does seem unbelievable, this super intelligent, infinite being, capable of creating not only everything we can see, but everything we can't see, and the laws and constants that support it, wants you to actually find him, to know him, to have a relationship with him. He's been dropping clues everywhere just so that maybe you would do that, both in this life and beyond it, to know your Heavenly Father. And Paul says, that's actually the point. That's actually the point. Now, of course, as I just mentioned a second ago, all of these evidences, and there are dozens more, could be followed up with like rabbit trails of more evidence and more nuance, and it's this but not that, and rebuttals, absolutely, and counter rebuttals back and forth, some of them more than others. But perhaps the greatest pushback to any of this, the greatest pushback to the idea of God, is the number one most asked question of them all. Okay, so then why is there so much pain and suffering? Why is there so much evil and injustice in the world? And I hope you'll come back and join us next week for part 3 of the series. Let me close this in prayer. Heavenly Father, I just want to thank you for loving us enough that you didn't leave us without evidence. You didn't leave us groping in the dark, that you have revealed yourself in nature, you have revealed yourself in humanity and in cultures, and you have especially revealed yourself in Jesus, so that we could see and know what you were like, and see and know what we're to be like, and what it means to be human, the glory that is part of each of our story. And I don't know where you're at with all of this. I might have just bugged you more than I helped you, and that is quite possible. I get that. But just maybe tonight you would say, okay, if there is anything to this at all, and I'm not saying there is, if there is a God, I would like to know who you are. I'm going to reach out just a little bit into the dark and maybe find you. If you are there, can you reveal yourself to me? And I invite you to pray that prayer. If you are there and if you are real, I would like to know that. I would not like to walk through the rest of my life blindly to something like this. And for the rest of us who say we believe in you, Father, I pray that our lives would so align with not only who you are, but who you keep telling us that we are, with the glory that you created us all with. I pray that for myself, and I pray that for all my friends. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, hey, thank you so much for joining us tonight. On your way out, don't forget to drop those Connect cards that Ethan and Scott were telling you about. We'd love to get to know you. If you're a guest, thank you so much for being here. If you've been around a while, we'd love to hear from everybody every week. Go ahead and fill that out. You can throw that in the offering baskets on the way out. Of course, you can throw offering envelopes in there too. That's kind of obvious. And hope that you come back next weekend for part 3 of this series. Why is there so much pain and suffering in the world? And you might have people who would like to hear that with you and who ask that question. So bring them with you next week as we jump into that. God bless you guys. Have a great week, and we'll see you next weekend. Play the tape.